The wind had a taste. Evelyn Hart decided this after 3 days of it scouring her face through the canvas flaps of the parish wagon. It tasted of dust so fine it was more like a memory of earth, of sun-baked sage, and a loneliness so vast it felt like the floor of heaven. When the wagon finally groaned to a halt, the silence that rushed in was louder than the rattle of the wheels had ever been. Wyoming Territory, 1889. The end of the summer was bleeding into the chill of autumn, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and squinting, grunted. "We are here." Here was a gate. It was made of cottonwood, weathered to the silver gray of an old bone, and it was attached to a long fence of lodgepole pines that stretched in either direction until the landscape simply swallowed it, beyond the gate. A modest ranch house sat sturdy and low to the ground, flanked by a barn and a web of corrals. The red dust of the yard was swept into lazy patterns by the same wind that had been her constant companion. A man was working on the gatepost, tamping the earth around its base with the butt of a shovel. He moved with a kind of quiet economy, no motion wasted. As he straightened, Evelyn saw he was tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his worn denim shirt. His hat was pushed back, revealing dark hair and a face that was hard to read, carved by the same elements that shaped the land. He looked up, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, and his gaze lingered on the parish wagon before settling on her. The driver swung down and began to wrestle her trunk from the back of the wagon. Its leather was scuffed, the brass fittings dull, a relic of a life in Boston that now felt as distant as a star. Evelyn gathered her skirts, which were expertly patched but hopelessly inadequate for this place, and climbed down, her legs unsteady. The man walked toward them, his boots making soft thuds in the dust. He did not smile. He stopped a few feet away, his attention fixed on her. Evelyn felt the heat of his inspection, from her dust-smudged cheek to the worn toes of her button boots. He seemed to be taking a silent inventory. She straightened her spine, a small act of defiance she had perfected over the past several months. She was Evelyn Hart, daughter of a printer, and she would not be cowed by a silent man and an empty horizon. The driver grunted again, dropping the trunk with a thud that sent up a puff of red powder. He tipped his hat. "Jedediah, she is yours to look after now. Reverend Abernathy sends his regards and will call upon you before Sunday." The man, Jedediah, gave a curt nod, his eyes never leaving Evelyn. He reached for the wooden latch of the gate, his hand covering a pale, star-shaped scar near his thumb, the kind a bullet might leave. He swung the wide gate inward, the motion smooth and silent. It opened onto the ranch yard, onto the low-slung house, onto the life that was now supposed to be hers. As she hesitated on the threshold, he took in her tired face and the determined set of her jaw. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He leaned his head just slightly toward her, and in a voice so low it was almost carried away by the wind, a murmur meant for him alone, he spoke. "Guess God finally sent my wife." The words were so quiet, so unexpected. They felt like a trick of the dry air. The ranch hands over by the corral had not heard. They were busy with a skittish-looking mare. The driver had not heard. He was already clambering back onto his wagon seat. But Evelyn heard. Every syllable landed in the pit of her stomach like a stone. Her breath caught. It was not a proposal. It was not a welcome. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the weary resignation of a man who had been waiting on a long overdue delivery. She stared at him, her carefully constructed composure threatening to shatter. Before she could form a reply, her shock was broken by a new disaster. As Jedediah reached for her trunk, the worn latch, strained by the journey, gave a sad little pop and fell open. The trunk tipped, spilling a small collection of its contents into the dust. A book of poetry by Miss Dickinson, a small tin of sewing needles, and a slender ribbon of blue silk, meant to tie back her hair. It uncoiled as it fell, revealing the single word printed upon it in stark white letters: "Strike." It lay there on the red earth like an accusation. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the yard. The driver, about to slap the reins, froze. The men at the corral turned their heads. Jedediah's gaze dropped from her face to the ribbon. He did not move, did not speak. His expression was a blank wall. Mortification washed over Evelyn, hot and absolute. She lunged forward, snatching the ribbon and shoving it deep into the pocket of her dress, her fingers fumbling as she tried to close the trunk. The word had branded her. In Boston. It had made her an outcast, the centerpiece of a scandal she had not created, here, in this raw, unforgiving land. She feared it would be a death sentence of a different sort. The rumor was born in that moment, in the shared, silent glances of the men who had seen. The woman from the east, the one with trouble packed right in her trunk. Later, the town of Larkspur proved to be little more than a single dusty street squinting under the vast sky. It held a telegraph office, a blacksmith's forge whose hammer blows echoed like a steady heartbeat, and a saloon that seemed to exhale the scent of stale beer and desperation. It was here, in a small office that smelled of dust and chewing tobacco, that Evelyn understood the true nature of her exile. Deputy Sheriff Boone was a man whose body seemed to have surrendered to gravity. His belly strained the buttons of his vest, and his face was soft and damp, even in the dry air. He held her papers, the official documents from the parish identifying her as an auxiliary assistant for the new mobile school, and he tapped them on his desk with a fleshy finger. "Reverend Abernathy is a good man," Boone said, his voice a low, syrupy drawl. "He believes in the power of redemption. But the county, well, we believe in the power of contracts." He slid his gaze from Evelyn to Jedediah, who stood silently beside her, his presence filling the small room. "What do you want?" "Boone?" Jedediah's voice was flat, cutting through the deputy's unctuous tone. The deputy smiled, a slow spreading of his thin lips. "It is a simple matter of civic cooperation. Coulter, the cattle syndicate requires unanimous consent to secure their water rights upstream. It is for the good of the whole valley. You understand. Progress. Your little ditch from Cottonwood Creek is the last holdout. Sign this waiver, and Miss Hart's papers are stamped and official. She can start teaching your little orphans to read tomorrow." It was a vice, and Evelyn could feel its jaws tightening around her. She was the leverage, her reputation. Her very right to exist in this place was being traded for water. Jedediah's hand, the one with the scar, rested on the butt of the pistol at his hip. He did not touch it, but the gesture was plain enough. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the law. "You are choking my ranch, Boone, and you are using the law to do it." "The judge in this county," Boone said, leaning back in his creaking chair, "has a great appreciation for men who understand the importance of large-scale enterprise, men like those in the syndicate. He appreciates them far more than he does one stubborn Pony Express rider trying to run a few head of cattle on a patch of dry dirt." The ride back to the ranch was silent, the setting sun painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The deal was laid out on the rough-hewn table in the main house, under the steady glow of a kerosene lamp. The room was simple, clean, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. "They need my signature to make their dam legal," Jedediah stated, his voice low. "They have been diverting most of the water for months, but the old territorial laws give me a claim. It is weak, but it is there. I have been preparing a legal complaint to send to the territorial capital. The problem is, my words are better on a horse than on paper." Evelyn looked at him, at the frustration etched around his eyes. He was a man accustomed to direct action, not the slow, grinding machinery of paperwork and crooked officials. "I need those papers," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "Without them? Reverend Abernathy has to send me back. The parish program has rules. I would be on the next train east." "And back to Boston," he said. It was not a question. She flinched. The shame of it was a physical thing, a constant ache behind her ribs. To be sent back would be to have the lies they told about her become the truth. Her father's printing press ruined, her family's name disgraced forever. Here, at least, she was just a stranger. She could be anyone. He looked at her, his gaze sharp and appraising. You know words. You can read and write them in a way that matters to a judge. I am the daughter of a printer, she affirmed, lifting her chin. I know how to set type. I know how to compose a letter. Then we have a bargain, he said, the words falling between them like stones building a foundation. You help me with this complaint. You use your Boston words to fight Boone and his syndicate. In return, I will give you a place to stay. I will tell the Reverend that you are under my protection and that your work here is vital. We will find a way to get your papers. It was a partnership born of pure desperation, a temporary alliance against a common enemy. Evelyn felt a flicker of something she had not felt in months. It was not hope. Not yet. But it was the firm ground of purpose. How long do we have, she asked. The circuit judge holds a hearing on water rights in 30 days, he replied. That is our deadline to file the complaint and gather what proof we can. And me? Reverend Abernathy has given you a probationary period. 30 days, he said, to prove you are a worthy and moral addition to the frontier. If you fail, he puts you on that train himself. 30 days. The timeline hung in the air, a circle drawn around them both. 30 days for him to save his ranch. 30 days for her to save her life. Later that night, in a small, spare room with a single window, Evelyn looked out into the immense, star-filled darkness. The land was so quiet, it felt like it was listening. In the distance, she could just make out the dark line of the Cottonwood Gate. It was no longer just a gate. It was the border between the life that had been stolen from her and the one she now had a month to build. It was the place where a stranger had looked at her, covered in the dust of her own disgrace, and spoken a prophecy she could not yet understand. Life at the Cottonwood Gate Ranch was measured not by the clock in the main house, whose pendulum had been still for years, but by the slow crawl of sunlight across the yard. Dawn arrived as a pale, milky wash in the east, and with it came the sounds of a world waking up to work, the low complaint of a milk cow, the sharp, rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel from the small smithy, the quiet murmur of men's voices as they prepared for the day. For Evelyn, it was a language she was slowly learning to comprehend. Her first lesson was in humility. Jedediah assigned her a horse, a gentle, sway-backed mare named Lucy with wise, liquid brown eyes. He showed her how to saddle the animal, his movements economical and precise, his voice a low rumble of instruction. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate press of ink on paper, felt clumsy and foreign wrapping the thick leather straps. The first time she tried to mount, she ended up in a heap in the dust, her skirts tangled around her ankles. One of the ranch hands, a young, freckle-faced orphan named Toby who tended the calves, let out a snicker before Jedediah silenced him with a look. Jedediah offered Evelyn a hand up, his grip firm and impersonal. He retrieved her bonnet, knocked the red dust from it against his thigh, and handed it back to her. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. A fleeting thing. There and gone. He told her that out here. The ground teaches faster than books. The house was run with quiet efficiency by 2 women. Rosa, the cook, was a widow whose round face was perpetually dusted with flour. She moved about her kitchen with a silent grace, producing biscuits and stews that seemed to be seasoned with a deep, unspoken sorrow. And then there was May Coulter, Jedediah's mother. She was a thin, bird-like woman who spent most of her days on the covered porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders even in the midday sun. She had a dry, persistent cough that punctuated the quiet afternoons, a sound that worried Evelyn more than anyone seemed to let on. May's eyes, the same stormy gray as her son's, missed nothing. She watched Evelyn move through the rhythms of the ranch, her gaze a silent, constant evaluation. Evelyn, desperate to prove her worth beyond the 30-day deadline, offered to cook the evening meal one night. Rosa, weary from a day of canning peaches, gratefully relented. Evelyn decided on baked beans, a simple Boston staple. She underestimated the fierce, expansive nature of the dried beans of the West. They swelled with an almost violent enthusiasm, first overflowing the pot, then a second, larger kettle. By sundown, she had a small mountain of bland, undercooked beans and a kitchen that looked like it had been through a minor war. The cowboys ate in grim silence, their jaws working methodically. Toby, with the brutal honesty of youth, declared them to be like eating little rocks. That night, a chorus of groans echoed from the bunkhouse. Evelyn, mortified, was scrubbing the last of the pots when Jedediah came into the kitchen. He did not say a word. He simply took a towel and began to dry the dishes she washed, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the worn ceramic plates. She could feel the laughter he was holding back, a silent tremor in the air between them. In that shared, quiet task, a small crack appeared in the wall of his solitude. To atone for the beans, she offered to mend his work shirt, which had a long tear along the sleeve. She sat on the porch in the evening light, May watching her with those observant eyes. Her stitches were tight and uneven, a far cry from the delicate embroidery her mother had taught her. She felt the familiar sting of her own inadequacy. When Jedediah came to collect the shirt, he ran his thumb over the jagged seam. She apologized, explaining it was not the kind of needlework she was used to. He looked at her, his expression serious, and said the seam was an honest one. It would hold. The simple praise warmed her more than she would have admitted. The days settled into a routine. Mornings were for ranch work, learning the 1,000 small tasks that kept the place alive. Afternoons, Evelyn would take Toby and the 2 younger children of a neighboring rancher to a shaded grove of cottonwoods by the creek bed, with a piece of slate propped against a log and charcoal for chalk. She held her makeshift school. She taught them their letters, the crisp, certain shapes a comfort in this wild, uncertain land. Her own past remained a constant, silent passenger. One afternoon, the lonesome wail of a train whistle drifted across the plains from Larkspur. The sound, thin and distant, pierced Evelyn like a shard of glass. She dropped the water bucket she was carrying, the splash unheard as her heart hammered against her ribs. The sound was a ghost, dragging her back to a crowded Boston platform. The faces of strangers a blur of condemnation, the firm grip of a parish official on her arm as he escorted her to her exile. She gasped for breath, the vast Wyoming sky suddenly feeling small and suffocating. Jedediah was nearby, mending a fence line. He saw the bucket, saw the look on her face. He did not approach, did not ask. He simply paused in his work, his presence a silent, steady anchor until the panic receded, leaving her trembling and ashamed. He understood something of her wounds, and in his silence, he gave her the gift of not having to explain them. He had wounds of his own. She was beginning to see. He held himself apart, a man who seemed most comfortable in the company of his horse and the wind. May spoke of it once, in her quiet, roundabout way. They were on the porch, watching Jedediah break a young colt in the corral, a tense dance of man and animal. May said that her son had lost a good friend, another rider for the Pony Express. In a blizzard years ago, they had found him frozen solid in the spring thaw. After that, Jedediah built his walls a little higher. He learned. May sighed, her cough rattling in her chest, that it was easier to suffer alone. The outside world intruded one Tuesday in the form of Reverend Abernathy, his buggy kicking up a cloud of righteous dust. He was a stern man, but not unkind. His faith a set of rigid rules he believed would protect his flock from chaos. He cleared his throat and spoke of his civic duty, of a quiet word from Deputy Boone, an unmarried woman. He explained, living under the roof of an unmarried man, it was a matter of propriety. Tongues in Larkspur were beginning to wag. Evelyn's stomach went cold. This was it, the end of her 30 days, cut short by gossip. Before she could speak, May rose slowly from her chair. She walked over and placed a frail but firm hand on Evelyn's arm. She informed the Reverend that Evelyn was her goddaughter, the child of a distant cousin from the East. She had been sent west for the mountain air to recover from a bout of lung fever. May's voice was smooth as worn river stone, her gaze unwavering. The lie was so seamless, so perfectly delivered, that for a moment Evelyn almost believed it herself. The Reverend, faced with the quiet steel of a mother protecting her own, could only nod and accept. The immediate threat receded. But Evelyn understood that May had not just told a lie. She had claimed her. She had drawn Evelyn into the small, fragile circle of their family. As the days shortened and the creek shrank, the weight of their 30-day bargain pressed heavier. Evelyn filled pages with careful script, drafting the legal complaint, her printer's blood relishing the precision of the words. She interviewed the few ranchers who had not yet been bought out by the syndicate, documenting their stories. But their proof was thin. One night, the kitchen was quiet save for the hiss of the kerosene lantern hanging by the door. Its light cast a warm, golden pool on the table where Evelyn worked. Jedediah entered, carrying a ledger. He told her a neighboring family, the Jensens, had sold their debt to the syndicate that morning. They were packing their wagon to leave for Oregon. The news landed heavily in the quiet room. They were becoming an island. He stood for a long moment, watching the fluid movement of her pen across the page. The lantern light softened the hard lines of his face. Then, without a word, he turned and went to a high shelf above the hearth. He took down a small, leather-bound journal, its cover softened and darkened with age and use. He placed it on the table in front of her, next to her stack of legal papers. He told her it held maps his father had drawn, and that he had added too. They showed the old ways of the water, the hidden springs and the forgotten tributaries, from before the syndicate came and tried to own the rain itself. He said maybe there was something in it that words in a courtroom could understand. Evelyn looked from the journal to his face. It was not just a book. It was his history, his inheritance. It was a trust far heavier and more valuable than any legal document. The lantern on the wall hummed softly, a steady beacon in the deepening night. A fragile hope began to kindle within her, a feeling as tentative and as precious as the last trickles of water fighting their way down the bed of Cottonwood Creek. The leather-bound journal was a map of ghosts. In its pages, Evelyn traced the faint, spidery lines of creeks that no longer ran in springs that had long since been choked by dust, all drawn in the faded brown ink of Jedediah's father. It was a testament to a time when water was a gift from the land, not a commodity to be hoarded by men with money. But a map of what used to be was not proof of a crime being committed now. For that, she needed ink of a different sort. She found it in a stack of county disbursement receipts from the general store in Larkspur, records so mundane no one had ever thought to scrutinize them. She had traded a week's worth of mending for the storekeeper's wife to get a look at them. Buried between invoices for barrels of nails and sacks of flour was a recurring, open-ended charge from the cattle syndicate. The category was listed as bridge maintenance, but the bridge over Cottonwood Creek was new, built with timber from Jedediah's own land in exchange for a year's worth of credit. There had been no maintenance. The payments, however, were regular, and they were made out to a list of names she did not recognize. Men who were not carpenters or masons. They were gunmen. The syndicate was not maintaining a bridge. It was funding an army and using public records to hide the expense. The discovery was a cold, hard stone of fact in the churning river of rumor and speculation. When she showed it to Jedediah, he studied the page for a long time, his jaw tight. "In Boston," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "they use ink to take a man's water. Here, we will use words to take it back." The town itself was a checkerboard of loyalties. In the saloon, talk was cheap and divided. Some ranchers, their own wells running low, argued that siding with the syndicate was simple survival. They offered water, however little, and paid their debts. Others, who had known the Coulter family for years, spoke of Jedediah's honesty and his father's fairness. They looked at the growing syndicate operation with a deep, ancestral suspicion of anything that grew too big, too fast. The water was dividing them, cutting new channels of resentment through the community as surely as it had once cut through the land. The tension took on a human face when Deputy Boone rode out to the ranch, 2 armed men flanking him. He did not come to the house but went straight to the bunkhouse, declaring his intention to search for seditious materials. He was looking. He announced loudly enough for Evelyn to hear from the porch, for pamphlets or papers that might incite unrest. It was a clear, pointed attack, meant to paint her with the same brush that had run her out of Boston. Jedediah met them at the watering trough, where he had been replacing a rotted plank. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, hammer in hand, his body placing him between Boone and the bunkhouse. The air grew thick and heavy. "This is a private residence, Deputy," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously calm. "You have no warrant." Boone's soft face flushed. "I have reason to suspect this woman you are harboring is a troublemaker. The county has an interest in maintaining order." Jedediah took a slow step forward. "The only trouble here is the creek running dry. If you want to maintain order, go order the syndicate to open their dam." The 2 men stared at each other over the dwindling pool of water, a tableau of the larger conflict. It was a fight over law and power, but here, in the dust, it was personal. Boone, seeing the unyielding rock of Jedediah's will, eventually backed down, sputtering threats about official inquiries before riding away. The confrontation left a bitter taste in the air, a promise of more to come. Nature, it seemed, was determined to have its say as well. The first storm of the season rolled in a week later, not with a gentle rain, but with a furious, biblical violence. The sky turned a bruised yellow-gray, and the wind tore at the ranch with a physical force, ripping shingles from the barn roof. Evelyn and Jedediah worked alongside the hands to secure the livestock, the rain coming down in cold, hard sheets. A frantic shout from Toby sent them running toward the lower pasture. A newborn calf, separated from its mother, had stumbled into a shallow gully just as the trickle of runoff became a churning, brown torrent. The calf bawled, its small body struggling against the rising water. Jedediah yelled for a rope, but Evelyn, seeing the water cresting the calf's back, did not wait. She scrambled down the slick bank, her skirts instantly heavy with mud, and grabbed for the animal. She got a hand on its neck, but the current was a living thing, powerful and indifferent. It pulled at her, and her feet slipped in the mud. For a terrifying second, she felt the water grab her, pulling her downstream. A hand clamped around her arm like a band of steel. Jedediah was there, his face a mask of grim determination against the driving rain. He hauled her back from the edge, his strength absolute. He pulled her and the sputtering calf onto the bank just as a wall of water, thick with debris, roared through the gully where she had been standing. They collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping for air, the rain plastering their hair to their faces. He did not let go of her arm. She could feel the frantic beat of his heart through his soaked shirt. Or perhaps it was her own. They were both trembling, from the cold and the adrenaline. In the relative quiet of the barn, the storm still raging outside, the aftermath was a strange, subdued intimacy. May met them at the door with 2 thick wool blankets, her face etched with worry. "Get those wet things off before you catch your death," she ordered, her voice raspy but firm. "Rosa will have hot ginger tea ready." The air in the barn was warm and smelled of hay and animals. A single lantern cast a golden glow, making the raindrops clinging to their hair and clothes glitter. Jedediah stripped off his wet shirt, his back and shoulders a landscape of taut muscle gleaming in the soft light. Evelyn, fumbling with her own wet clothes under the blanket, tried not to stare. He tossed her a dry shirt of his own, the worn flannel soft and smelling faintly of him. They stood in the circle of lantern light, wrapped in blankets, saying nothing. The shared danger had stripped away the pretense between them, leaving something raw and real in its place. A few days later, the mail rider brought a letter from Boston. It was from a friend, a fellow printer's daughter who had stood by Evelyn even after the scandal. Her friend wrote of the news she had uncovered. The man who had switched Evelyn's speech for the fiery tract on workers' rights. The man who had set the trap for her was a Mr. Penroy. He was a representative for a merchants' association, a man whose quiet, ruthless ambition was well known. And, the letter concluded, through a recent inheritance, he had become a minor shareholder in a new and aggressive Western enterprise, the Wyoming Cattle Syndicate. Evelyn read the words, and the world shifted. This was not a random misfortune. The shame that had followed her west was not a separate entity from the threat that now faced the ranch. They were connected. The same hand that had pushed her out of Boston was now trying to choke the life from this valley. The fight for the water was now her fight in a way it had never been before. The pressure mounted. The circuit judge sent word from Cheyenne. A hearing on the matter of the water rights for Cottonwood Creek was scheduled. It would be held in 2 weeks. The deadline, once a month away, now loomed like a thunderhead on the horizon. The next afternoon, Evelyn found Jedediah in the smithy, the rhythmic clang of his hammer shaping a glowing piece of iron into a horseshoe. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and coal smoke. Rosa, passing by with a basket of laundry, paused and called out with a weary smile, "If you two are going to make eyes at each other, do it somewhere quiet. All that hammering sounds like you are arguing about it." Jedediah's hammer faltered for a single beat. A dark flush crept up his neck. Evelyn felt her own cheeks grow warm. The simple, domestic joke, in the face of all their troubles, was both a comfort and a complication. She waited until Rosa was gone, then stepped into the fire-lit smithy. She held up the letter from Boston and the syndicate's doctored invoice. She told him everything, about Penroy, about the staged speech, about the thread that tied her past to his present. He listened, his hammer resting on the anvil, his face unreadable in the flickering light. When she was finished, he looked not at her, but at the water trough outside, its surface reflecting the hard, blue sky. He said nothing. He simply picked up his hammer and went back to work, the blows falling harder and faster than before, each one a punctuation mark in the silent, tense air. But she knew he had heard. The fight for the water had become a fight for her name. The wind that night was a restless spirit, whispering through the dry grass and rattling the frames of the windows. It was a nervous wind, the kind that made the horses shift in their stalls and the men in the bunkhouse tell ghost stories. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table, the lantern light casting a warm circle around her as she studied the faded lines on a map in the leather journal. The intricate web of forgotten waterways was becoming as familiar to her as the streets of Boston. She was tracing a promising tributary with her finger when the smell first reached her. It was sharp and acrid, not the familiar scent of wood smoke from the hearth, but something hungrier, more aggressive. At the same time, a shout erupted from the yard, followed by another. Jedediah was out of his chair in an instant, his face a hard mask in the lamplight. He threw open the door, and the scene outside was a nightmare vision. An angry orange glow pulsed against the blackness of the sky, centered on the hay barn that stood perilously close to the main irrigation ditch. Flames were already licking up the dry timber walls, devouring the season's supply of winter feed with a terrifying roar. Men were spilling from the bunkhouse, shouting and forming a disorganized bucket brigade from the nearly dry trough. But it was a futile effort. The wind was a malevolent partner to the fire, whipping the flames into a frenzy. Then a new, more terrible sound cut through the chaos, a high, thin scream of pure terror. "Toby," Jedediah breathed, his voice raw. The boy sometimes slept in the hayloft on warm nights, claiming the stars were brighter from up there. Without another word, Jedediah sprinted toward the burning structure. He grabbed a horse blanket from a railing, dunking it in the trough before wrapping it around his head and shoulders. Evelyn's heart seized in her chest. She saw him disappear into the churning smoke and roaring heart of the fire, a man walking willingly into hell. Her mind worked with a desperate clarity born of sheer panic. She could not just stand there. She tore her own heavy wool coat from its peg by the door and ran to the ditch, where a small pool of murky water remained. She plunged the coat into the water until it was heavy and sodden. She raced to the barn's wide entrance, the heat so intense it felt like a physical blow. She could see Jedediah inside, a silhouette moving through the swirling embers, calling Toby's name. She saw a small shape huddled in a far corner, a small boy paralyzed by fear. Jedediah reached him, but a burning beam crashed down, cutting off their escape. Evelyn did not hesitate, holding the soaking coat in front of her like a shield. She ran into the inferno. "Get him under this!" she yelled over the roar, her voice sounding strange and thin. Jedediah looked at her for a split second, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury that she would be so reckless. But there was no time to argue. He grabbed Toby, a small, coughing bundle of terror, and shoved him under the makeshift shelter of the wet coat. Together, the three of them stumbled back through the blinding smoke and falling embers, out into the cool, clean air of the night. They collapsed in the dust, coughing, gasping, their lungs burning. Toby was crying, but he was alive. The barn was a lost cause. They could only watch as the roof gave way in a volcanic eruption of sparks and flame. As the fire burned itself out, a new problem became horribly clear. The intense heat had baked the dry earth of the irrigation ditch bank beside the barn. The bank, already weakened by the lack of water, had crumbled, collapsing into the ditch and creating a massive earthen dam that blocked what little flow remained. The syndicate's fire had not just destroyed their hay, it had effectively sealed the fate of their water supply. By morning, the rumors had already begun to smolder among the exhausted ranch hands. The Boston woman. Trouble followed her. First the law, now fire. It was bad luck, they murmured. A dark cloud she had brought with her from the east. Evelyn heard the whispers and felt the cold, familiar sting of being an outsider, a blight. She was standing by the smoking ruins, the sour smell of ash thick in the air. When May Coulter came to her side, the older woman's face was pale, and her cough was worse in the smoky air, but her eyes were clear. She placed her thin, cool hand over Evelyn's. "In this family," May said, her voice a low, steady anchor in Evelyn's turmoil. "When the fire is hottest, we learn who stands with us. You stood with us last night. You are one of us." The simple words were a balm on a wound Evelyn had not even realized was bleeding so badly. She felt tears well in her eyes, tears of gratitude and exhaustion, and did not try to stop them. Later that day, Jedediah was kicking through the cooled ashes, assessing the damage. His foot struck something small and metallic. He bent down and picked up a small, tin matchbox. On its lid was a printed emblem, a stylized bull's head, and the words, "Union Stock Company." It was a well-known subsidiary of the cattle syndicate, their purchasing arm. It was not proof that would stand up in a court of law, but for the people of the Cottonwood Gate Ranch, it was a signature left at the scene of the crime. That night, an unnerving quiet settled over the ranch. The usual evening banter from the bunkhouse was gone, replaced by a sullen silence. Jedediah did not join them for the evening meal. Evelyn found him on the porch, sitting on the top step, his back to the house. He held an old guitar, its wood scarred and worn. He was not playing, just running his thumb over the strings, producing a series of soft, mournful notes that seemed to dissolve into the vast darkness. She saw in his posture the weight of the night's events, the fire, the rescue, the near loss of the boy he had taken in as his own. It had stirred something old and painful in him, the fear of losing another person he had allowed himself to care for. He was retreating back into his fortress of solitude, the place where it was easier to suffer alone. She went back inside and returned with the small medical tin. She sat on the step beside him, not too close, but near enough that he would know she was there. "Let me see your arm," she said softly. He did not look at her, but he extended his left arm. A nasty red burn ran along his forearm, an angry mark left by a falling ember. Her hands trembled slightly as she cleaned the wound and gently applied a salve. Her touch was light, clinical, yet in the small space between them, the air was thick with unspoken things. She could feel the warmth of his skin, hear the soft sound of his breathing. His heart, she imagined, was beating as erratically as her own. As she wrapped a clean linen bandage around the burn, she looked at his face, at the hard set of his jaw in the moonlight. "You do not have to save the world, Jedediah," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just do not let yourself get burned in the process." He finally turned his head and looked at her. His stormy eyes held a deep, aching vulnerability she had never seen before. He did not speak, but in that shared gaze, a silent understanding passed between them. He was not alone in this fight, and the knowledge seemed to both comfort and terrify him. The tension was finally broken the next morning by a small, reedy voice from the main house. Toby, recovering from his ordeal in May's own bed, had awoken. He was hungry. Rosa went to his bedside, offering him broth and biscuits. He waved them away. He wanted beans, he declared, but not the rocky kind. He wanted Rosa's beans. The request, so absurdly normal in the wake of such terror, rippled through the house. Rosa chuckled, a deep, warm sound. May smiled, a genuine, crinkle-eyed smile. And even Jedediah, when he heard, let out a short, rough laugh that sounded rusty from disuse. The simple, honest craving of a small boy had let the air back into their lungs. That evening, the mood had shifted. The fire had been a blow, but it had not broken them. It had forged them. Evelyn brought the leather journal to the kitchen table. Jedediah brought the syndicate matchbox. They were no longer just defending the ranch. They were taking the fight to the enemy. Together, under the steady glow of the lantern, they spread out the old maps. The journal was no longer just a collection of memories. It was a weapon. They traced the ghost rivers, comparing them to the current, syndicate-approved county survey maps. And there, on a page yellowed with age, they found it, a detailed drawing of a secondary channel, a natural overflow for Cottonwood Creek that ran directly through the land where the syndicate had built their new, illegal dam. Jedediah's father had labeled it Lifeline. The syndicate had not just diverted their water. They had deliberately blocked the land's own failsafe, its natural response to drought. It was a calculated act of strangulation. The faded ink in the old journal had just become their declaration of war. The syndicate's retaliation was not with fire, but with ink. A notice appeared one morning, nailed to the post outside the Larkspur General Store. The printing was crude, the letters thick and uneven, but the words were sharp enough to cut. It was an official-looking document, signed by Deputy Sheriff Boone, citing a territorial statute on public order. It named Evelyn Hart of Boston, Massachusetts, and spoke of credible reports concerning her involvement in labor agitation and incitement of public unrest in her former city. It concluded with a call for all law-abiding citizens to remain vigilant against outside influences seeking to disrupt the peace and prosperity of the county. It did not call her a criminal. It did not have to. The words were carefully chosen: weapons agitator, unrest, outside influence. They were poison, designed to turn a community of neighbors into a crowd of suspicious strangers. The effect was immediate and chilling. When Evelyn rode into town for supplies, conversations that had been lively and open just a day before died as she approached. Women who had previously offered a polite nod now found something intensely interesting in the dust at their feet. Men looked through her as if she were a ghost. She was no longer the quiet woman from the ranch, the makeshift schoolteacher. She was a headline, a walking, breathing piece of gossip. The poison seeped back to the ranches. The next afternoon, only Toby and one other child, the daughter of a rancher who owed Jedediah a favor, showed up for their lessons under the cottonwood tree. The parents of her other students had sent their apologies. It was a difficult time. They said it was best to be cautious. Evelyn's heart ached with a familiar, hollow pain. She had been erased once before by words on a page, and it was happening again. But as she looked at the two small, expectant faces before her, a different feeling took root, a stubborn, unyielding resolve. She would not let their fear steal this small patch of ground she had claimed. She set up her slate against the old log crate and picked up a piece of charcoal instead of their letters. She began to tell them a story. It was about a small fish, she said, who lived in a river that was being slowly filled with mud from upstream. The water grew thick and dirty, and it was hard for the fish to breathe. All the other fish decided it was easier to just float with the current, to let the dirty water carry them wherever it would. But this one little fish, she said, decided to swim upstream. It was hard work. The current pushed against her, and the mud got in her eyes. The other fish told her she was a fool, but she kept swimming because she remembered that far upstream, the water was clean and clear, and she believed it was worth fighting to get back there. Toby, his young face serious, asked if the little fish made it. Evelyn looked at him, her gaze soft but intense. The story is not over yet, she told him, but every inch she swims makes the river a little cleaner for the fish behind her. Courage, she explained, is not about being the strongest. It is about choosing to swim against the dirty water, even when you are alone. Later, as she was packing up the slate, Jedediah rode up. He had been checking the fences nearby and had heard the end of her story. He dismounted, his expression unreadable. "Can you still stand it?" he asked, his voice low. "The whispers, the looks." Evelyn finished tying the charcoal into a small cloth. She looked out across the parched land, toward the town that had turned its back on her. "I endure it," she replied, meeting his gaze, "so that maybe one day they will not have to." His stormy eyes held hers for a long moment. He gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of respect that meant more to her than 1,000 words of comfort. A small measure of grace arrived in the form of Reverend Abernathy. He came to the ranch not in his official capacity as a moral watchdog, but as a concerned pastor. He found Evelyn on the porch, mending a shirt for one of the hands while May rested inside. He accepted a glass of water, his gaze taking in the quiet, domestic scene. He had seen her at the fire. He had heard the whispers in town. But he had also heard from the wife of a poor homesteader that Evelyn had sat up all night with their feverish child, applying cool cloths to his head. He had seen the way Toby, once a sullen and withdrawn boy, now followed her with a kind of quiet devotion. The facts of her character, the evidence he saw with his own eyes, were beginning to wage a war against the accusations he had read on paper. He spoke of the difficulties of judging a soul, of the difference between reputation and truth. It was not an apology, but it was an opening, a crack in the wall of his rigid certainty. He was a man of the book, and he was beginning to see that her story was more complex than the one Boone had printed. The most crucial piece of their puzzle came from an unlikely source. Dr. Halbrook was Larkspur's only physician, a man whose passion for medicine was rivaled only by his obsession with collecting postage stamps. He was a meticulous man of science who believed in verifiable proof. Evelyn had sought him out, remembering his kindness when he had treated May's cough. She had told him about Mr. Penroy. The name was familiar to the doctor. Penroy had passed through the territory months earlier, part of a railroad expansion survey. Dr. Halbrook, intrigued by the puzzle, had sent a telegraph to a colleague in Omaha who worked for the Union Pacific Railroad and shared his philatelic interests. The reply came a week later. The colleague confirmed it. Mr. Penroy's signature was indeed on the syndicate's list of incorporating shareholders. It was a small stake, but it was there. He was not just a ghost from her past. He was an architect of her present. The doctor delivered the news with a quiet satisfaction, handing her the telegram as if it were a rare and valuable stamp. It was the first external, unimpeachable piece of evidence they had. That night, Evelyn laid it all out on the kitchen table, the doctor's telegram, the invoice for the non-existent bridge maintenance, the map from the leather journal. The truth felt solid, tangible. May, who had been watching from her chair by the hearth, spoke into the quiet room. Her voice was thin, but her words were heavy with the wisdom of a long life. "Truth is a good horse," she said, "but sometimes it needs a rider to win the race. It is not enough to be right. Evelyn, you need witnesses. You need people who will stand up in that courtroom and speak your truth alongside you." Evelyn looked at the papers, at the cold, hard facts. May was right. The syndicate had bought the silence of half the valley. The other half was paralyzed by fear. A list of facts on a page was no match for a room full of cowed men. The final blow came 2 days before the hearing. Deputy Boone returned, this time with a signed order from the county magistrate. He was not there to search the bunkhouse. He walked straight to the main house, the paper held in his hand like a weapon. The order authorized him to confiscate any and all materials related to the ongoing water dispute that could be considered inflammatory or destabilizing to the public peace. He walked directly to the high shelf above the hearth. "I will take that old journal," he said, his eyes fixed on Jedediah. Jedediah moved to block his path, his body going rigid with a cold, controlled fury. "That was my father's." "It is a collection of non-standard maps and notations," Boone said, his voice slick with false authority. "In the context of this dispute, it could be considered a document intended to subvert the official county surveys. It is evidence." He held out the order. It was legal, a piece of paper that twisted the law into a cudgel. To resist would be to break the law, to give them the very excuse they needed to lock Jedediah up. Slowly, deliberately, Jedediah stepped aside. His eyes were chips of ice. Boone reached up and took the small, leather-bound journal from the shelf. He held it for a moment, a look of smug triumph on his soft face. The book held more than maps. It held the memory of a family, the history of a valley, the last physical link to the man who had built this ranch. It held their best hope. Boone tucked it under his arm and walked out without another word. He left behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any shouting. He had taken their proof. He had taken their past, and with it, he seemed to have taken their future. The sky did not darken. It sickened. A jaundiced yellow-brown pallor leached the color from the landscape, and the sun became a pale, feverish eye behind a scrim of dust. The wind, which had been a restless whisper for days, began to howl, a low, guttural moan that scraped at the nerves. It was a dust storm, a rolling, tumbling wall of prairie earth that had been lifted from the parched ground and thrown into the air. The world shrank to the confines of the ranch house, where the windows were boarded and rags were stuffed into the cracks beneath the doors. The fine, gritty dust found its way in regardless, coating every surface in a thin, reddish film, making the air thick and hard to breathe. The cattle, their instincts screaming of a world turned upside down, were lowing in terror from the corrals. The storm raged for 2 days. When it finally subsided, it left behind a world remade in shades of brown and silence. The devastation was quiet but absolute. The last of the grass in the pastures was buried under a blanket of sterile dust. And the irrigation ditch, their last hope, was completely choked, filled to the brim with the sifted soil of the valley. Jedediah looked at the clogged channel, then at his thirsty, spooked cattle, and the decision was made for him. There was no other choice. To keep the herd would be to watch them starve. He would have to drive them to the railhead and sell them for whatever the syndicate's buyers were willing to offer. It was not just a loss, it was a surrender. It was the end of the Cottonwood Gate Ranch as his father had built it. Watching him ride out that morning at the head of his own funeral procession, a small, grim-faced line of men driving the herd toward its end, Evelyn felt a fire ignite in the pit of her stomach. It was a cold, clean rage. They had endured whispers and threats, fire, and now this biblical plague of dust. They had been patient. They had tried to work within the law, but the law had been stolen from them, locked away in the pages of a journal that now sat on Boone's desk. And she would not stand by and watch this family, this life she had just begun to find, be buried alive. She had a plan. born of desperation and the quiet fury of a printer's daughter. The numbers, the proof of the syndicate's slush fund for their gunmen, were in the county clerk's official ledger. A copy of that ledger, when placed next to their own meticulously drafted complaint, would be undeniable. She rode to town, telling Rosa she was going to see Dr. Halbrook for more of May's cough medicine. In Larkspur, she went first to the small dress shop run by a young woman named Daisy, whose sharp wit and nimble fingers were her greatest assets. Daisy was one of the few people in town who had offered Evelyn a kind word, a shared glance of solidarity against the tide of gossip. Evelyn explained her plan in hushed tones between bolts of calico. Daisy's eyes widened, but a determined smile touched her lips. She agreed without a moment's hesitation. The county clerk's office was empty, the clerk himself having gone to the saloon for his midday meal. Evelyn slipped inside, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The air was stale, smelling of old paper and sealing wax. The ledger was right where she expected, a massive, leather-bound volume on a high desk. Her hands, slick with a nervous sweat, fumbled as she opened it. She found the page, the bridge maintenance account, and began to copy the columns of names and figures onto the paper she had brought hidden in her reticule. Her pen flew, the frantic scratching of the nib the only sound in the suffocating silence. She was nearly finished when the door creaked open. Deputy Boone stood there, his bulk filling the doorway. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he saw her, hunched over the open ledger like a thief caught in the act. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with satisfaction. "It seems our little Boston agitator has a fondness for official documents." Evelyn froze, the pen dropping from her nerveless fingers. It was over. She was caught. At that exact moment, a commotion erupted from the street. A woman screamed. Daisy burst through the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Deputy," she cried, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of hysteria. "You must come quickly. Mrs. Gable has collapsed. It is her heart. She is not breathing." Boone hesitated, his gaze shifting from Evelyn to the frantic seamstress. He was a man who enjoyed the performance of authority, and a public medical emergency was a stage he could not resist. With a last, frustrated glare at Evelyn, he lumbered out of the office, shouting for someone to fetch Dr. Halbrook. Evelyn did not wait. She shoved the copied pages into her reticule, closed the ledger, and slipped out the back door, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She met Daisy in the alleyway behind the dress shop, her entire body trembling. Daisy gave her a quick, fierce hug. "Mrs. Gable," she whispered with a wink, had merely tripped over a stray dog and was now enjoying a complimentary sarsaparilla at the saloon, courtesy of the deputy. The ride back to the ranch was a blur. Evelyn felt a strange, giddy mixture of terror and triumph. She had done it. She had walked into the lion's den and stolen a piece of its mane. She found Jedediah on the porch, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before. He had returned from the railhead. The herd was gone. He did not ask where she had been. He did not seem to have the energy for it. In the lamplight of the kitchen, she saw the scrape on the back of her hand, a long, raw scratch she must have gotten scrambling out of the clerk's office. It was bleeding sluggishly. Jedediah saw it too. He rose from the table, his movements stiff, and went to the cabinet where they kept a bottle of corn liquor for medicinal purposes. He poured a little onto a clean rag, his hands, usually so steady, trembling with a barely suppressed violence. It was not the tremor of fatigue. It was rage, and it was fear. He took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, and began to clean the wound. The liquor stung, and she hissed in a sharp breath. He did not look at her face. He kept his eyes on her hand, his voice a low, rough growl when he finally spoke. "Do not ever take a risk like that alone again. You hear me?" The words were raw, stripped of his usual reserve. He had not said you. He had used a softer, more intimate form of the word, a term a man might use for his wife. for someone who belonged inside the circle of his protection. He seemed to realize it as soon as he said it, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the rag. A dark flush rose on his neck. The air between them became charged, thick with the weight of the word he had let slip, the wall he had just accidentally breached. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Evelyn looked at their hands, his large, calloused one holding hers, and a small, tremulous smile touched her lips. She broke the tension with a whisper. "Yes, boss." He looked up then, startled. He saw the gentle humor in her eyes, the understanding, and a sound escaped him that she had never heard before, a short, sharp laugh, full of surprise and relief. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time. From her chair by the hearth, May watched them, her expression soft. A brave heart has to learn to lean on others. "Son," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of an old truth. "It is the hardest lesson there is." Later that evening, as Evelyn was preparing for bed, May came to her room. She did not speak. She simply placed a small, folded piece of linen in Evelyn's hand. It was a handkerchief, immaculately clean and smelling of lavender. In one corner, in neat, careful stitches of blue thread, was a single letter, E. The final turn of the screw came the next day, the day before the hearing. A rider from town delivered an official summons. It was not for Jedediah. It was for Evelyn. She was being called to appear before a special meeting of the town council, convened by Reverend Abernathy at the request of Deputy Boone. The purpose of the meeting, the summons stated, was to conduct a review of her moral conduct and fitness to serve as an educational auxiliary. It was a public shaming, scheduled to take place just hours before the water rights hearing. It was designed to discredit her, to humiliate her, to turn their star witness into a pariah before she could even speak a word in court. Her last line of retreat had been cut off. That night, Jedediah stood with her on the porch, the summons crumpled in his fist. The sky was clear, the stars cold and brilliant. The fight was no longer just about the ranch. It was about everything. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and steady as the stone foundation of the house, "we go to court for the water. The day after, we get your name back." It was not a hope, it was a promise. The county meeting room in Larkspur was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. It was packed far beyond its capacity, the air thick with the competing smells of dust, sweat, and cheap tobacco. Ranchers whose faces were maps of sun and worry stood shoulder to shoulder with saloon regulars and shopkeepers, their loyalties a tense, unspoken current in the room. At the front, the circuit judge, a man with a face like carved granite and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed, sat behind a heavy oak desk. The syndicate's lawyer was a slick, well-dressed man from Cheyenne, his voice as smooth and polished as the stone in his ring. He spoke of progress and the greater good, citing Territorial Article 12, a little-known and vaguely worded provision that allowed for the construction of temporary auxiliary dams in times of exceptional drought. He painted Jedediah as a stubborn holdout, an impediment to the prosperity of the entire valley. He made it all sound so reasonable, so legal. When it was her turn, Evelyn stood, the sheaf of papers in her hand a solid, comforting weight. She was not in a Boston lecture hall, but the principle was the same. The truth, laid out in black and white. She spoke clearly, her voice steady, ignoring the hostile stares and whispered comments. She presented her copy of the county ledger, the pages filled with her own neat, precise script. She walked the judge through the numbers, her finger tracing the column of payments for bridge maintenance. She pointed out the names, the dates, the impossible sum paid for work that was never done. It was not maintenance. She stated it was a payroll for hired guns. Then Jedediah stepped forward. He unrolled a large piece of butcher paper on which he had painstakingly copied the map of the Lifeline channel from his father's journal. He explained how the syndicate's dam was not just a diversion. It was a deliberate and calculated obstruction of a natural, historical waterway, a chokehold on the land itself. The syndicate lawyer scoffed, dismissing the drawing as sentimental fiction. But the judge looked at it, his expression thoughtful. The first crack in the syndicate's armor came from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Halbrook was called to the stand. He was calm, methodical, a man of science in a room roiling with emotion. He presented the telegram from his colleague in Omaha, and with the quiet authority of a man stating a verifiable fact, he confirmed that a Mr. Penroy of Boston was indeed a shareholder of record in the Wyoming Cattle Syndicate. A murmur went through the room. The name, the connection, tied the faceless corporation to a single man, a man whose name was now linked to the woman they had all been whispering about. The second crack was a seismic tremor. Reverend Abernathy rose, his tall, spare frame commanding attention. A hush fell. Everyone expected a sermon on propriety, a condemnation of the Boston woman. Instead, he faced the judge and spoke of what he had witnessed. He spoke of Evelyn Hart's quiet dedication to the children, of her sitting with the sick, of her courage at the fire. He said that while the law must concern itself with paper, a man of God must concern himself with character. And the character he had observed, he stated, his voice ringing with conviction, was one of integrity and fortitude. It was a stunning blow to Boone's carefully laid trap. The public shaming had been preempted by a public defense from the town's highest moral authority. Boone, his face a mottled, furious red, saw his case unraveling. He played his final, desperate card. He stood and addressed the judge, his voice dripping with theatrical indignation. He held up the leather-bound journal he had confiscated from the ranch. "Your Honor," he boomed, "these fanciful maps and unsubstantiated claims are all based on this, a personal diary, a document, I might add, that was obtained improperly and is therefore inadmissible as evidence. Any copies made from it are the fruit of a poisoned tree." The lawyer from Cheyenne smiled. It was a solid legal point. The room tensed. It seemed, for a moment, that the entire case, built on a foundation of memory and meticulous copying, was about to collapse. Then, from the back of the room, a clear voice called out, "Excuse me, Your Honor!" It was Daisy, the seamstress. She made her way forward, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fierce light. In her hands, she carried another book. It was smaller than Jedediah's journal, a simple, cloth-bound ledger, but it was filled with the same precise, hand-drawn maps and notes. "Miss Hart is the daughter of a printer, Your Honor," Daisy said, her voice trembling slightly but never faltering. "She believes in making copies, for safekeeping." She transcribed the most important parts of the Coulter family journal into this second book weeks ago, right after the fire, before the deputy ever took the original. She laid the book on the judge's desk. It was not stolen. It was not inadmissible. It was a woman's foresight, a printer's daughter's faith in the power of the duplicate. It was the truth, twice told. The judge looked from the copy to the original, then at the furious face of the syndicate lawyer, and finally at the stunned expression on Deputy Boone. He brought his gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack. "This court orders a 30-day injunction," he declared. "The auxiliary dam will be opened, and the natural flow of water to the Cottonwood Creek ditch will be restored pending a full investigation by the territorial marshal." The room erupted. The syndicate's men looked murderous. Jedediah gripped Evelyn's arm, a silent, powerful message of victory. They had won. It was not a final victory, but it was air. It was water. It was a chance. Retaliation came that very night, swift and brutal. They were in the kitchen, a sense of exhausted relief settling over them for the first time in weeks, when they heard it. A low, powerful roar from the direction of the main head gate, a sound of immense pressure being violently released. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, his face grim. He grabbed a lantern, and Evelyn was right behind him, her heart pounding with a new and immediate dread. Toby, drawn by the commotion, followed them out into the darkness. his eyes wide. The scene at the head gate was one of controlled chaos. The main valve, a heavy iron wheel that controlled the flow of water from the newly released creek into their irrigation ditch, had been smashed with a sledgehammer. Water, their precious, hard-won water, was not flowing into their ditch but gushing out into a fallow field, a torrent of wasted life sinking uselessly into the dry earth. In the flickering lantern light, they saw the backs of 2 men on horseback, fleeing into the darkness. Jedediah swore, a low, vicious sound. He shoved the lantern into Toby's hand. "Stay here," he ordered, and ran after them, disappearing into the night. Evelyn was left with the roaring water and the terrified boy. The problem was immediate and overwhelming. They had to stop the flow. She saw a pile of old fence posts and loose timbers nearby, remnants of a repair job. It was their only hope. "Help me!" she yelled to Toby over the noise. Together, they dragged a heavy timber to the edge of the gushing water, trying to lever it into the breach, to create a makeshift dam. The water fought them, a powerful, living force. It was cold and terrifyingly strong. They managed to wedge one post into place, then another. They were slowing the flood, but not stopping it. Evelyn saw a larger beam, part of the broken valve assembly itself, half submerged in the churning water. If she could just work it loose, they could block the main channel. She waded into the knee-deep water, her skirts instantly becoming a leaden weight. She gripped the beam, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on the slick, wet wood. She pulled, putting all of her weight into it. The beam shifted, and for a second, she thought she had it. Then a new surge of water, released from some upstream pressure, came roaring down the channel. It struck her like a physical blow, knocking her feet out from under her. The current grabbed her, pulling her into its powerful embrace. The lantern on the bank became a receding star. The world was a roaring, black, icy chaos. A raw, primal shout cut through the noise. Jedediah. He was back. He lunged into the water. A desperate, reckless dive. His hand closed on the fabric of her dress, then on her arm. His grip an iron vise. He dug his heels into the muddy bank and pulled, his muscles straining with the effort of fighting the river for her life. He hauled her out, and they collapsed together onto the slick, muddy earth, a tangle of soaked and shivering limbs. For a long moment, they just lay there, gasping, the roar of the water a backdrop to the ragged sound of their own breathing. He was still holding her, his arms wrapped around her as if he might never let go. He was trembling. She realized, a fine, deep tremor that shook his entire body. He buried his face in her wet hair, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was a hoarse, broken thing she had never heard before. "Do not," he choked out, the words ragged. "Do not you ever scare me like that again." She clung to him, her own fear slowly receding, replaced by a profound, aching tenderness. She looked past him, at the muddy water still flowing into their ditch, a chaotic but life-giving stream. She looked at Toby, standing on the bank, the lantern held high, a small, brave beacon in the vast, hostile night. "We have too many people to keep on this side of the bank," she whispered into his shoulder, her voice thick with tears and river water. The water was flowing. It was a mess. It was a fight, but it was flowing. A rider came from town the next day with 2 pieces of news. The first was that the sentiment in Larkspur had turned decisively in their favor. The midnight attack had been a step too far even for the syndicate's supporters. The second was a telegram for Jedediah. Mr. Penroy was taking the train from Cheyenne. He would be arriving in person to oversee his company's interests. The architect of her downfall was coming to finish the job himself. Mr. Penroy arrived on the afternoon train, a specter of Boston propriety set against the raw, unforgiving backdrop of Wyoming. He wore a fine wool coat with a velvet collar that seemed to absorb the light, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine, an insult to the dusty street. He did not come to the ranch. Instead, he sent a summons, requesting a private meeting with Evelyn and Jedediah in the parlor of the Larkspur Hotel. His voice was exactly as Evelyn remembered, smooth, measured, and coated in a veneer of reasonable morality that made her skin crawl. He spoke of his Christian duty, of his concern for her fallen state. He had come, he said, to offer her a path to redemption. The path was simple. She would sign a full confession detailing her role in the Boston unrest, a document he had already prepared. She would renounce her radical views and return east under his personal supervision, where he would secure a quiet, respectable position for her in a distant parish. In exchange for this act of public contrition, all investigations into her conduct would be dropped. And, he added, turning his calm, reptilian gaze to Jedediah, as a gesture of goodwill and a sign of his commitment to the peaceful prosperity of the valley, the syndicate would be willing to purchase the Cottonwood Gate Ranch for a generous price, forgiving any outstanding debts. It was, he concluded with a thin smile, a solution that benefited everyone. Evelyn listened, a cold, still calm settling over her. The shame that had been her constant companion for months was gone, burned away by the fire and the flood and the fight for this place. She was no longer the disgraced girl he had sent into exile. "I will not go back to be a piece on your board. Mr. Penroy," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the stuffy parlor. "I will not sign your lies. If you wish to discuss my past, you may do so publicly, at a town hearing, where I will tell my own story." Penroy's smile did not waver, but a coldness entered his eyes. "That would be most unwise, Miss Hart. A public spectacle would only solidify your ruin." "Then I will be ruined in the light," she replied, "not in the shadows of your backroom deals." She stood, and Jedediah rose with her. The meeting was over. That evening, the weather turned. The wind, which had been a dry, dusty sigh, developed a sharp, biting edge. The sky, which had been a hard, endless blue, thickened to a uniform slate gray. The temperature plummeted. By nightfall, the first hard, granular pellets of snow began to rattle against the windows. It was an early, vicious storm, a snarling beast of a blizzard that had swept down from the high peaks with no warning. The world outside the ranch house dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and driving snow. The newly repaired irrigation ditch, their symbol of victory, disappeared under a rapidly deepening blanket of white. A new crisis was upon them, immediate and elemental. The small herd of cattle they had managed to keep back from the sale, the breeding stock that represented their future, had been in the far pasture. In a whiteout like this, they would drift with the storm, lose their way, and freeze. There was no discussion. Jedediah began pulling on his heaviest coat, his face set in grim lines. He had to go out. He had to try to find them and drive them into the shelter of the canyons. It was a fool's errand, a ride into the teeth of a frozen hurricane, but not to try was to surrender. Evelyn's heart clenched with a cold fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. Inside, another, quieter crisis was unfolding. May's cough, always worse in the damp and cold, had taken on a frightening, rattling edge. The frigid air was a poison in her lungs. Their duties divided them. He had to save the body of the ranch. She had to save its heart. He took her by the shoulders before he left, his hands warm and firm through her dress. His eyes were dark with 1,000 unspoken fears. "Be safe," was all he said. Then he was gone, a shadow swallowed by the swirling white. Evelyn was left in the besieged house with May and Toby, the howl of the wind a constant, menacing chorus. She kept the fire roaring, brewed endless cups of hot, steaming tea for May, and tried to project a calm she was far from feeling. The hours crawled by, each one a small eternity. Sometime after midnight, a loud, insistent pounding on the door cut through the shriek of the wind. It was not Jedediah. It was a sound of demand, not return. Toby ran to the window, peering through a small crack in the boards. "It is Mr. Penroy," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. And Deputy Boone. Evelyn's blood went cold. She knew, with a sickening certainty, what this was. They had come to finish it. They thought she was alone, unprotected. She told Toby to stay with May, to be quiet. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. A blast of icy wind and snow roared into the room. Penroy stood on the porch, his fine coat dusted with white, his face impassive. Boone and 2 of his hired thugs stood behind him, their faces cruel in the lantern light. "A terrible night, Miss Hart," Penroy said, stepping inside as if invited, bringing the chill of the storm with him. "I have come to offer you one last chance to reconsider my generous offer." He held out the confession. "The same paper from the hotel. Sign it, now, and we will forget this unfortunate business." "I have already given you my answer," she said, her voice betraying none of the terror she felt. "Then perhaps this will clarify your position," he said. "Deputy Boone has a warrant for your arrest, incitement to riot, based on a sworn statement from a former business associate in Boston. A federal offense. You will be taken to the territorial prison in Cheyenne to await trial. Unless, of course, you sign." It was the final checkmate. The kitchen, which had been a warm sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. But Penroy had misjudged her. He had mistaken the quiet printer's daughter for a helpless pawn. He did not know that her father, upon hearing of her assignment to the frontier, had sent her one last crate. It had arrived weeks ago. A small, heavy box containing not books or clothes, but a tool of her trade. A small, cast-iron hand press, with a calm that felt utterly alien to the frantic beating of her own heart. Evelyn walked over to the crate in the corner. Penroy watched her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. She opened the lid. "You want a confession, Mr. Penroy," she said, her voice steady. "Very well. I will print one for you." She worked quickly, her hands moving with an old, familiar grace. She took out a small letter he had written to a colleague a year ago, a letter her friend in Boston had found and sent to her. It was a letter in which he boasted of his plan to use a disgraced radical to stir up trouble and discredit the labor movement, a service for which he was promised a small but significant share in a new Western land venture. Her hands flew. She set the type, her fingers plucking the small metal letters from their case. She inked the plate, the smell of the black ink sharp and clean. She laid a fresh sheet of paper on the platen, and with a firm, steady pull of the lever, she made her own truth. She printed a perfect copy of his treachery. She pulled the page from the press and held it out to him. "It is a confession," she said, "but it is yours, not mine." Penroy's face, for the first time, lost its mask of calm. A dark, ugly rage contorted his features. He lunged for the paper, but she was too quick. "Boone," he snarled, "take her." The 2 thugs moved forward, their intentions clear. At that moment, a high, piercing whistle cut through the storm from the back of the house. It was the signal whistle Jedediah had given Toby, the one used to call the men from the far fields. The kitchen door burst open, but it was not Jedediah. It was Daisy, her face grim, her hair wild, and in her hands she held a large, black cast-iron skillet, gripping it like a battle-axe. The momentary, absurd shock of her appearance was all they needed. The front door was thrown open with a force that shook the house. Jedediah stood there, framed against the swirling snow, his face and clothes caked in ice, looking like an avenging winter spirit. And behind him, crowded onto the porch, were a dozen men from the neighboring ranches, their faces hard, their eyes narrowed, rifles held loosely in their hands. They were half the town. A silent, grim jury summoned by a boy's whistle. Boone's hand, which had been reaching for his pistol, froze. The thugs took a half-step back. They were bullies and hired guns, not soldiers. They had no stomach for a fight against a dozen determined men on their own land. Penroy stared, his mask of civilization completely stripped away. revealing the snarling predator beneath. Reverend Abernathy pushed his way through the crowd. In the face of this clear and present threat to the peace of this community, he declared, his voice booming with righteous authority, "I am calling an emergency meeting of the town council, here, now!" Penroy was disarmed, his hands bound loosely with a length of rope from the pantry. He would be held until the circuit judge could be summoned in the morning. Boone and his men, stripped of their authority by the will of the people, simply melted back into the storm. The house fell silent. The only sound the muffled hiss of the snow against the windows and the weary sighs of the men who had come to their aid. One by one, they nodded to Jedediah and left, their presence no longer needed. Soon, only Jedediah and Evelyn were left in the kitchen, the air thick with the aftermath of the fight and the profound quiet of the snow. He was exhausted, his body slumping with a weariness that went bone deep. He walked to the table and placed something small and dark on the rough wood. It was a horseshoe nail, one he must have been carrying in his pocket, that he had painstakingly bent and worked into the shape of a simple, perfect circle, a ring. He did not look at her. He looked at the small, humble object on the table. "For later," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, "if you still want it." Evelyn looked at him, at his ice-flecked hair and his weary, beautiful face. She looked at the simple ring made of iron and intention, and she smiled, a slow, radiant smile that broke through the tears that were suddenly, silently streaming down her face. The world was born new in the morning, silent and white under a fresh blanket of snow. The sun, when it rose, struck the landscape with a clean, blinding light, making every fence post and bare cottonwood branch a stark black line against the brilliance. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a profound peace, as if the land itself had exhaled. The circuit judge arrived not with a thunder of authority, but in a simple sleigh, his presence quiet and grave. He did not convene his court in the official meeting room, but in the large, warm kitchen of the Coulter Ranch, the place that had become the heart of the conflict. The townspeople who had stood with them through the night were there, not as a mob, but as silent witnesses, their presence a solid wall of community will. The proceedings were swift and decisive. It was not a trial, but a final accounting. Evelyn laid her evidence on the scrubbed pine table, the copy of Penroy's letter, its ink a stark confession of his conspiracy. The meticulously copied ledger pages detailing the syndicate's payroll for its Phantom Bridge crew. The telegram from Dr. Halbrook confirming Penroy's financial stake. Daisy placed the second, copied journal beside them, its existence a quiet testament to foresight and friendship. Penroy, his face pale and drawn in the harsh morning light, attempted to bluster and deny, his smooth voice cracking under the weight of the undeniable proof. But his words were hollow, the polished veneer of his civility stripped away to reveal the raw greed beneath. The judge listened patiently, his gaze missing nothing, his expression unchanging. He examined the papers, his silence more damning than any accusation. When he finally looked up, he did not address Penroy. He looked at Deputy Boone. He said that the law is a shield, meant to protect the community. In Boone's hands, it had become a club. He stripped the badge from Boone's chest himself, the small piece of tin making a dull, insignificant clatter as it hit the floor. The verdict was a simple recitation of facts that had become self-evident. Mr. Penroy was to be held for the territorial marshal on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and incitement. The syndicate's claim on the auxiliary dam was declared null and void, an illegal seizure of public resources. They were ordered to dismantle it at their own expense. The water rights of Cottonwood Creek, the judge declared, belonged not to a corporation in Cheyenne, but to the people who lived and worked beside it, according to the customs and claims that predated any corporate charter. And finally, he turned to Evelyn. He took her parish papers, which Boone had held for so long, and stamped them with his official seal. He handed them back to her, the ink still wet. "Your name is cleared. Miss Hart," he said, "your position is restored. Welcome to Wyoming. It was over. The weight that had been pressing down on them for months simply lifted, dissolving into the clean, cold air. The thaw that followed was more than just the melting of the snow. It was a melting of the fear and suspicion that had frozen the heart of the community. The next morning, the parents who had withdrawn their children from her lessons brought them back, their expressions a mixture of shame and relief. The small outdoor school under the cottonwoods was full again, the sound of children reciting their letters, a promise of a future that had almost been stolen. May, her strength returning with the clearing of the air, organized a collection of flour and cured meat for the families whose small homesteads had been hit hardest by the syndicate's drought. Wagons that had once passed each other on the road with averted eyes now stopped, the drivers sharing news and offering help. The fight for the water had nearly broken them, but the victory was binding them together. Men from a half-dozen ranches showed up at the Broken Head Gate with shovels and teams of horses, and together, they rebuilt the banks of the ditch, their shared labor a testament to their renewed community. The children, caught up in the spirit of it, made small paper flags and stuck them in the damp earth along the new bank. On each flag, in the careful, wobbly letters Evelyn had taught them, were the words, "Water is life." Late that afternoon, when the work was done and the sun was slanting low, casting long, golden shadows across the snow-dusted fields, Jedediah found Evelyn by the corral. He did not speak, but simply held out a hand to her. She took it, and together they walked, their boots making soft crunching sounds in the snow, toward the place where it had all begun. They stopped at the Cottonwood Gate. It stood open, a wide, welcoming space between the life she had left behind and the one she had found. He reached out and gently pushed it, so it swung almost closed, then pulled it open again, the motion slow and deliberate, a past sealed, a future embraced. He turned to face her, the low, golden light catching the lines of exhaustion and hope on his face. He looked down at the ground for a moment, gathering himself, a man wrestling with words he had never known how to use. When he looked up, his stormy eyes were clear and deep and full of a feeling that needed no translation. He spoke, his voice a low murmur, almost the same as it had been that first day, but this time every word was meant for her, clear and certain and stripped of all ambiguity. "Guess God finally sent my wife." He paused, his breath a small white cloud in the cold air. "If she will have me." The words, so simple and so profound, hung in the quiet space between them. Evelyn felt a familiar, delightful spark of defiance rise up to meet the tears that were suddenly blurring her vision. She put her hands on her hips, her head tilted. "Are you asking me, Jedediah Coulter, or are you reporting a fact?" A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "I am asking," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Then she was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that mingled with the tears rolling down her cheeks. She threw her arms around his neck and pulled him close. "Yes," she whispered into his rough coat, the word a promise and a prayer. "Yes." He held her tightly, his calloused hands gentle in her hair. She felt him press something small and cool into her palm. It was the ring, the circle of bent iron, a humble and perfect promise of a life that would be simple and strong and true. "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. But the words were a declaration, spoken to him, to the land, to herself, and my heart is here to stay. They were married on a Sunday in late autumn, not in a church, but under the vast, benevolent canopy of the cottonwood grove where Evelyn held her school. There was no altar, only a wide circle on the ground marked out with a length of clean white rope, a simple, unbroken loop to signify their union. The entire valley, it seemed, was there. Men stood with their hats in their hands, their faces scrubbed clean, and women wore their best calico dresses, their presence a quiet testament to a community mended. Rosa, outdoing herself, had baked a mountain of cornbread, the edges of which were just slightly, endearingly burnt. A fiddle player from a neighboring ranch drew a scratchy, hesitant tune from his instrument, a melody full of more heart than skill. It was a perfectly imperfect celebration. May, wrapped in her warmest shawl, sat on a chair brought from the house. Her cough was a soft, gentle punctuation to the quiet murmur of the gathering, but her eyes, when she looked at Jedediah and Evelyn, were bright with a fierce, profound joy. As Reverend Abernathy spoke the simple, binding words, she reached out and squeezed Evelyn's hand, a silent, powerful blessing that said more than any sermon. Evelyn wore no veil, only a simple blue dress, and in her hair was a sprig of the same rugged sagebrush that scented the air. Jedediah, looking uncomfortable but resolute in a clean shirt, placed the ring he had made, the small circle of a horseshoe nail, onto her finger. It was cool and solid and felt more real than any gold or diamond ever could. Life settled into a new rhythm, one marked not by desperation, but by deliberate, hopeful work. The school under the cottonwoods thrived, the slate board now permanently propped against a sturdy easel Jedediah had built. The sound of children learning to read became a part of the ranch's daily music. In the evenings, the small hand press her father had sent became a tool for the whole valley. Evelyn, with Jedediah's help, printed clear, simple flyers outlining the judge's ruling on community water rights, ensuring no corporation could ever again use ignorance of the law as a weapon. They printed notices about barn raisings and shared harvests, the small machine binding them together with ink and information. Jedediah, in turn, spent his days not just rebuilding his own ranch, but his neighbors as well. He rode out to help mend fences that had fallen into disrepair, to advise on strengthening ditch banks, to share what little breeding stock he had left. He was no longer just the stubborn man from the Cottonwood Gate. He was a leader, a man whose quiet integrity had become the bedrock of their collective future. He was building back the trust the syndicate had tried to poison, one fence post, one shared handshake at a time. The kitchen, once a place of tension and quiet meals, was now filled with a light-hearted warmth. Toby, puffed up with a new and solemn importance, declared himself the official head of the committee for beans that can be chewed. He would inspect Rosa's cooking pot with a grave expression, occasionally offering a suggestion. Much to the cook's amusement, Rosa, for her part, loudly proclaimed that while Jedediah might be the boss of the ranch, she was the undisputed queen of the kitchen, and her word was law. The easy laughter that followed these pronouncements was the sound of a family that had not been born of blood, but forged in fire and loyalty, a bond made stronger by the shared choice to stand together. The symbols of their struggle became the cornerstones of their peace. The heavy gate at the entrance to the ranch, once a barrier against a hostile world, now stood open most days, a welcome to friends and neighbors. The kerosene lantern still hung by the kitchen door, its steady glow no longer a lonely beacon in the dark, but a warm, inviting light promising safety and company. Jedediah's father's journal, returned by the judge, sat on the hearth, its pages a revered history, a reminder of the legacy they were now building upon. And on Evelyn's hand, the simple iron ring was a constant, tangible promise of a love that was not fragile or ornate, but durable and true, made from the very stuff of their hard-working lives. The water, the reason for it all, now flowed steadily in the ditch, a quiet, constant murmur of life and perseverance. The healing was not absolute. In the saloon in Larkspur, there were still a few men who would mutter into their beer about the trouble that had come with the Boston woman. The sting of prejudice did not vanish overnight, but the whispers were fewer now, and they were drowned out by the growing chorus of respect. The true victory, Evelyn knew, was quieter and would take longer to measure. It was in the hands of the children who could now read the flyers she printed, who could sign their own names, who were growing up in a valley where they had seen their parents stand together against a powerful enemy and win. That was a lesson no book could teach, and a victory that would echo for a generation. The days took on a gentle, steady cadence. The mornings were filled with the smell of horse leather and brewing coffee, the creak of the porch swing, the sight of the mist rising off the fields. Life was a tapestry of small, tangible moments, the feel of Jedediah's hand finding hers as they sat on the porch in the evenings, the pride in Toby's face as he learned to mend a harness, the sound of May's soft, peaceful breathing as she napped in the afternoon sun. It was a life built not with grand gestures, but with the steady accumulation of small, decent, hard-working days. They had found their peace not in the absence of hardship, but in the strength they had discovered to face it together. They made plans for the future. As the next dry season approached, Jedediah, with the help of his neighbors, began constructing a tall, sturdy windmill, a new way to draw water from deep within the earth. It was the first step toward their shared dream, a water cooperative, a union of all the small ranchers in the valley, ensuring that their most precious resource would forever be managed by the community, for the community. It was a future built on the foundation of the justice they had fought for with ink and courage and sweat. The gate was still open, the water was still flowing, and when the wind passed through the field, someone smiled softly, as on the first day, because God, in the end, had sent his bride. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where in the world you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help share this tale with more people.